Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to take the ideas of the fourth turning and apply them to the entertainment we see around us today. Now, if you don't know what the fourth turning is, it's basically summarized in the ideas that strong men make good times make weak men make hard times make strong men. And on that note, I have to say, if you want strong men entertainment, you should click on the link in the description or on the pinned comment and go on over and see if my new graphic novel, Crom the Destroyer, is for you. It's a return to form for low fantasy. Here you get heroic individuals. Men are real men, women are real women, and it's a story centered around death and honor. And if you're more into superheroes, I also have 2 superhero graphic novels. The link for those are in the description as well. You can go to the Valiant Heroes campaign and order both of them there. You're looking at some of the beautiful art from Crom the Destroyer in the background. So again, if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on those links in the description and go on over and order yourself a copy of one of my graphic novels today. But as I said with my topic, I want to talk about what is basically the fourth turning and apply it to entertainment. However, I would say that my ideas more are generated from books like The Economic Theory of Democracy. I think that was Anthony Dodd's. Anyways, it's a very great read, although it's probably fairly expensive to get a hold of. I read it for the first time probably about 25 years ago now, so it should be readily available. But the thing is that he takes democracy and how politics works, and he breaks everything down to equations. And he says, this is why people do X, Y, and Z. Now, if you know that book, you might say there are certain flaws within his thinking. Number one being he assumes that people act in a rational manner. And that's really not how people act, especially when they're trying to figure out what to do politically. And I would say that's the standard of how they should act. So it's a good way to look at the very least, the most economical way of doing things, the way that you're going to get the most profit. And secondly, some might say that he's very simplistic in boiling everything down into equations. And I would say, again, simplistic doesn't mean that it's wrong. I would say that simplistic is very good in looking at a problem because first you have to understand that 1 + 1 = 2 before you go into heavy equations. 1 + 1 = 2 is not wrong. It's just simplistic, but again, that's a good basis to start from. And that's what I'm going to do with looking at the economic situation within the entertainment industry. And as always, I use the comic book industry as a microcosm of what is going on within the entertainment industry itself. Why? Because A, I have very good information on the comic book industry. Those people like to talk. It's a very self-contained industry, so you can see what is going on with the broad strokes of entertainment and how it actually is affecting people on the ground, etc., etc. Although I think this can be certainly stretched to a larger viewing of entertainment as a whole in itself. And the starting point of this is something that I've been talking about in my channel for quite some time now, years now. But I think it was very succinctly expressed by Richard Meyer over at Comics Matter over the last week. He said, comics are no longer for men. Comics are now for women and alphabet people. You know, those rainbow attached people. We'll just put it that way. And I would take that and actually boil it down to the fact that you have basically 2 camps. Because I'm one of those stodgy old people that think, yeah, there's just male and female, there's just men and women. And I would say that you have 2 camps. One is pro-male, pro-men, and the other is anti-male, anti-men. And so in what he was expressing, I would say comics used to be for men and people who were pro-men, people who saw that being a man, as it naturally extends from just who you are, is a good thing, and that could include women, certainly. But now it's for people who are anti-men, people who see being male as something toxic. Whether it be because they're women and they're captured by ideas of feminism, whether they're your alphabet people who think that this is something that doesn't actually exist, etc., etc. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, I'll have to say that because the idea of the fourth turning is basically circular, I'm just going to pick a point in the circle and begin there, and we'll bring the entire thing looping back around on itself as we get to the end. So, in regards to that, I would also say that this turning within the entertainment industry has happened a number of times, and specifically within the comic industry, I would say it has happened at least 3 times since comics were created in the early 1900s, and that the turning for these systems, that would be entertainment as a whole or comics specifically, doesn't have to go or follow the turning within society itself at large. But again, let's just pick a point so that we can start to discuss this. And I would say a good point to pick, which would be within the minds of everybody here, or at the very least something that you're familiar with, would be the fact that you had a very healthy comic industry within the 1980s. It was really doing well, firing on all cylinders, and towards the 1980s into the 1990s, you got a industry that was making a lot of money. So it was a healthy industry, but at the same time, that industry was concentrating almost exclusively upon men. Men were their target audience, or at the very least males, and they were doing quite well. Now, the movement from doing quite well into harder times for that industry is certainly not something that you can nail down to one specific problem. I would say there's probably many problems that caused the fall of the comic industry. Number one being greed, number two being laziness. You know, just the normal everyday human things that ensure that you're not always going to be on a high. But the thing is that most industries, and this is not just for today, but for the last, several decades at least, look at always increasing their profit margin. So they see any dip in their profit margin as being something negative, even though it's probably something they should view as cyclical. And this reaching for profits to go higher and higher continuously led into some bad practices within the industry, which then led to a very unhealthy industry, which then led to economic hard times. But that's not exactly where I'm going with this. My point is that this is not the turning that I am going to be talking about. It's what happened after that point. Because here's the thing. There is something within, well, I guess most people would use capitalism. I don't particularly like to use the word capitalism because it has too many connotations and connections to socialist and communist ideology. I would say the free market system that is much more aligned with what we live under within North America, and hopefully will continue to live under over the next, lifetime, if not more. But the point is that there is something which appears to be a flaw within the free market system, but it's not really. It's a flaw within the people who are now and have for the last, 50 years minimum, operated the free market system. And it's an idea that I would say, if you boil it down, comes from secular humanism. And that idea is the fact that men and women are exactly the same. Or at the very least, you can boil men and women down to be exactly the same so that you can view them just as customers. Not male customers and female customers, no, just customers. Again, I don't think this is something that is inherent within the free market system. It is something which has been ideologically taught to the people who run the free market system over the last number of decades, and it is a problem because it isn't true. I usually go on about the fact that on my channel, you look at even scientific evidence for the fact that men and women have different eye structure. There are two different kinds of cells within eyes, M cells and P cells. Women have more of one so that they can see more colors, and as such, they can't see shapes and movement as well, whereas men have more of the other, which means they can't see as many colors, but they can see shapes and movement better, and this goes towards what each of the bodies of males and females are actually geared towards, whether it be child rearing on the one hand or hunting on the other. But the point is that even looking at little babies who can see something more than a blob of color for the first time, by showing them pictures, they see that this eye structure actually tends little babies that are male to be more fascinated by the mechanical and females to be more fascinated by human faces. This affects the way this plus many other things within the human body and the human mind, and I would also include the human soul, that affect the development of how men and women actually grow up, and then in accord with that, how they interact with things around them, and certainly how they interact with entertainment. Now, I hesitate and hate to use this example, but it's one that's very telling. It's the fact that if you look at the interaction of men and women with what is basically pornography, you'll see that men are more drawn to the pictorial, whereas women are basically drawn to descriptions of such things, because that's what a lot of romance novels are. They're just pornography in the form of a novel. And again, I would say this goes right back to the nature of human beings and the nature of our bodies, how they're constructed, all these kinds of things. So men and women are attracted to different things. And again, I would say this is part of the reason why something like comics or even movies and television, maybe even video games, which are highly visual, are more prized by men than they are by women. But let's go back to that struggling comic industry at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s. Now you see, you have this struggling industry which is saying to itself, how can we go back to having nothing but highs? And they would hit upon the idea of, oh, I know, let's expand our audience. How do we do that? Well, we're looking at our audience, and our audience base is primarily men, or males, if we're including young men in this as well. Why don't we expand it to everybody? Then we can, at the very least, double our subscriber base or our customer base, and then we can be back on top and continue to make money. Now, I would say this is a mindset that started to develop around the mid-1990s and certainly began to take hold within the early aughts and certainly was full-fledged, full bore, we're going in this direction by 2009, 2010. This is something that various comic pros that I covered on my channel have explicitly stated. Sana Amanat, the person who basically ran, or at the very least was second in command of Marvel Comics for more than 10 years between about 2009 was the beginning of her training, and that led up to about 2020, 2021 when she finally departed, has specifically said that when she was approached to be a part of the Marvel team, they said to her, we want you to come and restructure the entire way Marvel comics are made, the way comics itself are made, and to move us away from our traditional fan base of what they basically described as fanboys. So, males. And there's plenty of other examples. One of the Kellys, I can't remember if it was Kelly Sudaconic or Kelly Thompson, basically said in an interview that as far as she was concerned, it's okay to chip away at that main tentpole of comics, which was straight white men. So again, you have plenty of examples of the fact that this was something that was full bore and a planned strategy by the basic minimum 2009. Now, let's look at a couple of reasons why this doesn't work and hasn't worked. Number one being, of course, as I just mentioned, the fact that men and women are attracted to different forms of entertainment. But I guess at the same time, we should look at the reasons why, if you're looking at the situation and thinking to yourself that men and women are basically the same, why would it be attractive to the people who actually run the company? Well, the first reason, of course, as I just mentioned, would be the fact that you have an extra part of the fan base that you could just draw in that you haven't drawn in before. Number two, and again, I have substantial evidence to back this up, the industry for certainly Marvel Comics basically went upon the assumption that they had already captured all of the male audience and that they were going nowhere. They had them and they weren't going to leave. It didn't matter what they did with their comics. Again, this would be expressed by that statement by the Kelly that I was just talking about, because that statement is assuming that those people, that tentpole of the fanboys, yeah, they're not going anywhere. You can discard them at your leisure, but they're not going anywhere. They're always going to hold up as much as they possibly can. So you have them captured. Or again, statements from people like Sana Amanat saying when she was trying to promote, I think it was the Miss Marvel cartoon series that was on Disney Plus, if I remember correctly, she said, we already have the kicking of the butts down. That's the way she expressed it. But we have to move into territory now of, can you be a good friend? And she was talking basically about character development, which is what she was in charge of, and how to sell this to an audience, and saying, we already have the males are going to come and they're going to consume this anyways. Now we have to feed into the female aspect in order to draw females in. And I suppose I should add, and you probably have been looking at this in the background for a little while with my stills, the fact that one of the major events that has been going on for the last 3 years and continuously looking like it has possibly no end within the Marvel Universe, their main event for several years is a gala ball where everybody dresses up in high fashion. Now, this makes no sense within the world itself because it happens every year, which is basically once every 3 months within the Marvel time. So yeah, it makes no sense. Or the fact that Marvel has employed a fashion writer, someone who writes exclusively about the fashion of the people within the comics for, I think it's about 7 years now. These are not things that would attract men towards your comics. This is exclusively things that would attract the female. But anyways, one of the other reasons why this would appear to be attractive is because if you look at the numbers, or at the very least, the numbers that I last looked at, you would see that women slightly have an advantage as to how much disposable income they have as compared to men. So they have more disposable income than men on average, again, according to the numbers I last saw. And I would add to that, men, in my experience anyways, are typically the ones who, when push comes to shove and you have to forfeit your disposable income for things you actually need, the males are the ones who are typically going to do that first. So you have a untapped customer base of people with actually more money than the ones that you're tapping into now. So again, if you're looking at it through men and women are the same, you're going to say, let's do that. Now, I would counter that point with the fact that if you look at how men and women are actually different, you would see that men are actually much more brand loyal than women are. And you can extrapolate that from, again, psychological studies that basically show that if you look at the friendships between men and other men, it's typically much stronger than between women and other women. Personally, quite honestly, I'll give you this little bit of my own experience of the fact. I had this guy who was my friend within university, and he was only my friend for about 3 years at that time. And I ran over him with my car. Now, this was an accident and he's fine, but he was extremely upset with me, but he didn't stop being my friend, and he's my friend to this day. Whereas I have good friends who are females who have basically destroyed lifelong relationships with other females because the other woman actually didn't show up on time for something that she thought was important. To me, again, I would say this is my personal experience. This is drawn out by some psychological studies, and you can apply this, I would say, to brand loyalty as well. Guys have heavy brand loyalty. Women, not so much. And I think, again, you can see this within some of the statements that are being put out on the podcast within the people who run something like Marvel Comics. They're slightly confused about the fact that women are not being drawn to their brand just like men are. And if they are being drawn to it, they're there for a little bit and then they just disappear. They can't quite understand this because they don't understand there's a difference between men and women. For me, on the other hand, I remember when I was young, I got stuck someplace in the middle of nowhere. There was a tiny little stand. It had comics. It was the first time I was introduced to Ann Nesenti's Daredevil. It was during the Inferno X-Men saga. And before that, my brother had always collected, Frank Miller Daredevil. But that was the first time I really got introduced to it. And I liked that story so much and that comic so much that I bought Daredevil for the next 10 years. Never missing an issue, even though I thought it dipped below subpar many a times. But I guess my point of going over all these examples is the fact that if you look at them and the way that they are massaged as data by the people who run industries right now, it's massaged data in a very specific ideological bent, wherein the men factors are actually downplayed and they don't care about them, and the women factors that make the women look good, they're actually holding on to those with a death grip, hoping it will save them. And the negative factors within women's behavior, they discard those and don't even want to hear anybody consider them. Again, this would be expressed within the podcasts of Marvel that I go over all the time, wherein you hear them talking about the feminist ideological way of thinking, wherein men have power, which is competitive and destructive, but women are empowered, which is always cooperative and creative. And that leads me into my final point about how this might appear to be attractive to go after this female audience, even though it's not going to work out for them. The final nail in that coffin is that if you're going to go towards a more female-centric product, you're actually going to hire more females, and it costs less within just plain old management and money to hire females than males. No, not because of the wage gap. That's a myth. And it's a myth because the fact is, men make more money on the whole because they take more dangerous jobs, which then translates into higher salaries, or if they're doing the same jobs as females, they are the ones who actually go into the boss's office and say, I need a raise or I'm gone. Again, I'll give you a personal story, which is actually quite relevant to what I'm talking about. The only real job I ever had in my entire life, I worked for a law firm for about 3 years. Besides that, I've been basically an entrepreneur. But as I was working there when I first began, I got a verbal agreement that they were going to give me a raise at a certain time. That time passed and they didn't give me a raise. And then I kept pushing and pushing. Now, I don't know if females would push and push, but I kept pushing and pushing, saying, you promised me a raise, where is it? And I pushed so much that at one point they sat down with me and said, yeah, we're not giving you that raise. It doesn't matter what we said. It was just verbal. You can't prove that. We're a bunch of lawyers. There's no way you can win against us. And they thought they had me under their thumb, I think because the majority of people in that field were female and they were used to dealing with them in that way. And the next thing out of my mouth was, good, there's my 2 weeks notice. So basically, they were used to dealing with females who would not do anything of the kind, and they were quite flabbergasted when I walked out the door. Aside from that, I went from there and began my own business, which was typically in a field where there was about 80% women and only about 20% men. And the thing was, that industry was constructed in such a way that it was highly female-led, wherein it was social constructs that actually made up how they determined what to do for work and how their work would proceed. And I came in there with my own ways of doing things, and I did them in a way where I was innovating, and quite literally, I was able to take what most of the females in the same position as me were taking about 40 hours to do, and I could squish it down into about 10 hours because I had more efficient ways of doing things. I didn't bother with all this social rigmarole that they had to go through in order to talk to people, all this kind of thing. And when the 80% of the females in that field found out that I was doing, and that some of those really good clients were starting to drop them and go over to me, they tried to socially ostracize me to get me to abandon that way of working. And it didn't work at all because, first of all, I'm not there to be social. And secondly, the fact that they socially ostracized me actually gave me more time to do what I actually wanted to do, which was work, because they didn't blab on to me all the time and try to engage me in conversation. But the point is, you see, within that realm that I was working, you not only had a female-centric way of doing it, which downplayed any idea of innovation, any idea of change, but it was one where these women governed their own by social pressure so that nobody received more than anybody else. So if you have an office full of 10 guys, you're going to get 2 or 3 of them that are the alpha males. They're going to start making more money because they're going to demand it, because they're going to put in innovation and extra time. And then those other males are going to say, why can't I get this much money? The boss is going to say, because you don't do as well, you don't do as much, do better, and you're going to get a more efficient office. Whereas if you get an office of 10 females doing the exact same thing, they're going to police each other so that nobody actually comes up with better ways to do things. Everything's based upon the social, which takes much more time, and nobody is going to actually go to the boss and say, give me more money, because if they do, they're going to be ostracized by the other 9 females in the office, and they're going to have to leave. So again, my point being that if my personal experience holds, and I would say this is more than just personal experience, I'm sure there's people out there with studies that will prove this kind of thing. If you have an office full of almost entirely females, or people who are males but act in a female way, they're going to A, be much easier to control, and B, you're going to pay them less because they're not going to be people who are actually looking for raises. But at the same time, you got to realize that there's the trade-off that you're not going to innovate and you're not going to get competitive employees that actually make your product better and better. But again, ideological constraints have directed industry right now towards the idea that yes, everything female is good, everything male is bad, and therefore they continue to hold on with a death grip to the idea that the female customer will save them. And it's nothing but a fantasy. And so that brings us into the hard times for this industry, which is what we're seeing right now. Now, one caveat to all of this before I move on. Someone might be saying, well, this is just the North American comic industry and entertainment industry that you're looking at specifically. It doesn't work like that in places like Japan. And you look at manga as compared to comics, it doesn't work that way. They have a healthy female audience, and they continue to have it even now after decades of going through all of the changes in what they make and how they make it. I would say not quite. I would say, and again, you can argue with me in the comments about this, that the only reason why they have a difference there is because they have a much more fixed way of dealing with male and female. It is something akin to probably what you would see within the social structures of North America within the 1920s and 30s. And yes, that has led to much more stability and how they deal with markets and understanding the difference between male and female. But at the same time, if you look at people who actually have been fans of manga and anime for not just, the last 5 or 10 years, but for 30 or 40 years, you can see a lot of females saying and lamenting the fact that stuff like shoujo, which is heavily directed towards women, is actually losing much of what it once had to make it exclusively for women. They're saying that there is a bleeding in of other kinds of art styles and storytelling that are veering it away from what it typically was meant to do. And at the same time, there's a bleeding out of what it uses as good storytelling and art into other genres, so that it's slowly, very slowly, wasting away. Or at the same time, you look at something more specific. There was an interview that I saw, or basically a translation of an interview I saw, with the creator of My Hero Academia. And no, I don't particularly know a whole lot about either the anime or the manga, so I'm just giving you the rough notes here. But his intent, he stated, at the first was to have 2 male main characters and 1 female main character, and that triad was going to make up who they were going to concentrate on within the story arcs. But he abandoned that after not too long a time to have 3 male protagonists as the main focus of the book and the stories. Why? Because there was a demand more for that 3rd male than the 3rd female, and so with those market forces, it went in that direction. And really, I think that's the point. I think it happens within manga and anime very slowly, but it's the exact same thing that has happened over and over again within not just North American comics, but North American entertainment, is the fact that men are more competitive. And when you have a male and female part of the entertainment that are standing there side by side, the male is going to grow and grow and grow and overshadow that female part until that female part then becomes eclipsed by the male, because the male is more competitive, and the expression of that competitive spirit generates more money for the people who are actually creating the things, and so they go more and more in this direction. And that's where I want to go with the idea of this is something that has happened historically within, at the very least, the comic industry for entertainment in North America several times. I would say this happened once already. The fact that within the early days of comics, within the time of its inception and first creation, you had a lot of creators, people who you would know as household names if you followed comics, people like Jack Kirby or Gil Kane or even John Buscema or Buscemi, however you say his last name. They all started off in this industry that had both male and female sets of comics. And when they were just breaking into the industry, they began working on what? They began working on the female comics, the romance comics and such things, because that's where you started. And as they built up more and more experience, and by the way, most of these men, when you listen to the interviews about how they broke into the industry, would constantly say things like, I needed more money, therefore I had to do X, Y, and Z. These were people who were trying to provide for their mothers, their fathers, their wives, their new children. They needed money. They were hungry for money. So innovation and trying to do things in a better way was part and parcel of the competitive nature because they were hungry. And so when they became hungry and competed and actually became better artists, better storytellers, then they moved from that female section of this entertainment to the more male section of the entertainment. And that's where we know them from, most of them anyways. I don't think anybody remembers Jack Kirby for his work on romance comics, etc., etc. You see, why did they move over? Because that's where the money was. Because they needed the money, and when they became better artists, better storytellers, they migrated over to where they would make more money. That was in the male realm, and so you got an eclipse of the male, of the female within the comic industry itself. To me, this would be the first time that this has happened within the comics as a form of entertainment since it began. It was something very amorphous, diffuse. It occurred over a long span of time, but it was a migration of the talent from the female section of this form of entertainment to the male. I would also say this happened within basically the 60s. You could add the early 50s as well, when you had DC within what we would call its campy phase, where it had these idiotic stories and characters. And oh, by the way, what did they start to do? They started to put out more and more romance comics. If you look at things like Supergirl, this was really, if you look at it, even though it was a superhero comic, more of a romance comic than anything else. So you had this within the comic industry again at that time. And how was it dealt with? Well, it was dealt with by Marvel coming along and starting to kick the butt of DC. Why? Because it innovated, because it focused on what males typically wanted, and it gave that audience, which had been kicked to the side, exactly what they hungered for. And even then, they were just a bunch of hippies trying to do the best that they could. It wasn't until Jim Shooter came in within the early 1980s and actually made this company into a well-oiled machine that it began to fire on all cylinders. And what did you see? You saw an abandonment of anything like those old, campy, female-centered, romance-centered comics that DC was pushing for the 2 decades before that. And this is exactly the same thing that you see going on right now. This same turning is about to occur. Now, if you'll notice, it is something that, in my estimation, grew steadily and steadily as this ideological bent of seeing males and females as exactly the same continued and grew throughout the last century. If you take what I say as being accurate and then look at it within its first iteration, you'll see that it was very diffuse, and it occurred within the realm of the artists and storytellers themselves. But when it happened a second time, there was a readjustment according to a new player on the scene, which is a new company, which entirely changed the industry. But today, you have it grown to a proportion wherein you have, once again, a male audience that has been abandoned by the people who are making the entertainment product. They have no intent of trying to woo them back. And so you're seeing an emergence of a parallel industry to take on the old guard and to rebalance the scales. And of course, it's seemingly coming out of the blue to these people who work in the comic industry that things are happening where, let's say, Eric July, who wrote his first comic and then made almost $4 million off of it, wrote his second comic and has now made, at the very least, more than $2 million out of it. This is the beginning of a new industry. And I've talked to Eric personally. We had a discussion, which is part of the interviews on my channel, and we talked besides that off screen. So we were talking for at least an hour and a half, and yeah, it's his intent to build a new company that will be an industry leader. If that's where he can go with it, that's what he's going to do. Or if you want to look at other forms of entertainment, you could look at this new company that is supposedly going to be set up in the near future by Mel Gibson and Mark Wahlberg, which is going to be concentrating on a more balanced way of telling a story. Let's just put it that way. But as I said, this is seemingly coming out of the blue to the people who are running the industry. Why? Because they think in a female way. It's don't rock the boat. Be social. Everybody police their own. Nobody can have any more than the rest. And oh, by the way, if you want to try to actually do things differently, go make your own industry. And they say that because they don't believe anybody has either the gumption or the ability to do so. Probably because of their ideological constraints, which again say that men and women are the same. Therefore, men act in the same way that women can, and women act in a superior way, and that superior way doesn't allow them to do that, so therefore no one else can do that. So this fourth turning, as it were, for the entertainment industry is based upon, first of all, the idea that, well, if you look at the majority of entertainment, it is visually based, or at the very least, heavily visually influenced in one way or another. And men are attracted more to the visual than the females are. If you take that into consideration and then apply it to the entertainment industry, you can see that you have industries at one point in history where they have a large male base, which is very loyal to them, and they're making good money. So this making of good money is the good times. This good times leads into a faux understanding of how to increase profit, which is to bring the female in what is essentially male, or at the very least has been constructed as essentially male in order to make those good times. then you have a degradation of the way that the industry itself works because it's proceeding upon false information. This leads into the pursuit of what is essentially a weak customer base. This weak customer base dips sales, which brings hard times. This hard times leads to those people who are typically more innovative and willing to take risks, which naturally we know is predominantly male. To begin something that is new, this new thing starts to take off and then supplants the old industry. And the kicker for all this, for me anyways, since I'm one of these people, small though I am, creating this alternative entertainment industry, I get emails from people saying, yes, you're giving me what I want, what I hunger for, what I used to know as great comics, but I also get emails from people saying things like, I had never bought a comic before in my life, but I decided that I was going to buy yours, or off of what you were saying, a comic from somebody like Eric July, and I thought it was amazing. And in addition to that, having them say that my books or Eric's books are appealing to them because of what I'm always going on about, which is the traditional idea of a hero. They are hungry for heroes. But the point being that we're not only drawing in the older people, we're also creating new fans. That is to say, fans of the medium, not fans of us. And I think the key word here is innovation. Because if you look around at any entertainment, not just comics, all you're going to see nowadays is the rehashing of old ideas, the retelling of old stories, the telling of stories that people, let's say in comic form, read in the 1980s or 90s, or sometimes even the 1970s, and they're putting them up on the big screen. It doesn't matter. They're not new ideas. You're not innovating. You're not giving us anything new. And in going over all of this, I'm not saying it to put women down, to say the way you do things doesn't work. I'm sure it works for you. I'm sure it works in the way that you want things to proceed. But it's also a way in which it's keep your head down, don't rock the boat. And at some point, you gotta understand. Quite simply, guys don't work that way. And more importantly, nor does innovation. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, the links are in the description and on the pinned comment for my new graphic novel, Crom the Destroyer, a return to form for the strong men low fantasy, and also a link for my 2 superhero graphic novels, Thomas Valiant and the Valiant Heroes. So click on those links in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novels are for you. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.